Ida Early Comes Over the Mountain by Robert Birch. The Early Aim and the Carnival. The week before school was to start, there was a fair in Buckley. At lunch on Saturday, Mr. Sutton told his family, "I had hoped to take you, but we have a rush order at the yard." He was talking about the lumber yard where he was foreman. "So I must work." They all groaned. "But you can go without me," said Mr. Sutton, "provided Ida'll watch over you." "It'd pleasure me," said Ida, and as soon as everyone had finished eating, Ida and the children rode as far as the lumber yard with Mr. Sutton. They would walk across town to the fair. Just as they crossed the main street, Ellen's friend Nancy Parker came out of the drugstore. The boys and Ida Early waited while Ellen chatted with her. Randall had never liked Nancy. She was always bragging about the advantages town children had over the ones who lived in the country. At the moment, she was telling about a prom party that someone was planning. "We're to wear evening dresses," said Nancy, "and I'm not sure I'll know how to act." Ida Early, standing off to the side, said, "Just act natural." Nancy looked at her, and Ida struck a match on the seat of her overalls and lit a cigarette. "Are you related to the Suttons?" asked Nancy, in a tone that meant she certainly hoped not. "Not a bit." She blew a perfect smoke ring and added, "I'm their girlfriend." Nancy suddenly remembered she'd forgotten something in the drugstore and hurried back inside. Ida started away, holding Dewey by one hand and Clay by the other. Randall and Ellen lagged behind. Randall laughed about Nancy rushing away in a huff, but Ellen didn't think it was funny. "Ida's an embarrassment sometimes," she said disgustedly, but by the time they were at the fair she was in a better humor. Ida said, "Randall, maybe you and Ellen would have fun going your own way for a while." "What about us?" asked Clay. "Well, I thought you and Dewey and I'd have a good time on some of the rides that might not interest anybody else. We'll get back together at nearer time to go home." "Fine," said Randall. "Here's part of the money that your pa gave us," said Ida, handing Ellen and Randall more than half of it. "Spend it however you like." When they were separating, Ellen said, "Don't anybody fall off the merry-go-round." "We won't," promised Dewey, who had fallen off one of the horses at last year's fair. "Don't fall off anything," cautioned Randall. "Me or Dewey?" asked Clay. "Neither of you," said Randall. "Stay close to Ida and behave." Randall and Ellen went first to the Ferris wheel, and while they were waiting in line, Marcus Ragsdale came along. "Come ride with us," invited Randall, and Marcus was quick to accept. This, of course, pleased Ellen, and after the ride, the three of them walked around the midway together. An hour later, they were back where they had started. J.C. had joined them, and he and Randall stood watching the Lupa-Sky, a ride that was new to the fair this year. It was like a giant pendulum, and riders, fashioned in a cage-like compartment, were swung back and forth until it eventually went over. Then it went over and over, faster and faster, and the compartment spun around at the same time. More people watched it than had the nerve to get on it. J.C. said, "I dare you to ride it." "I'm trying to get up courage," said Randall. "I'll ride it if you will." "Not me," said J.C., looking up at the compartment that was spinning around at the same time it looped over. "It makes me dizzy just to watch." Randall was saying that he believed he'd hold off till another year to take a ride on it when the Lupa-Sky came to a halt. An attendant unfastened the door and opened it, and out came Clay, Dewey, and Ida Early. Randall laughed. "I thought you'd be over at the kiddie cars." "We like this best," said Dewey, glancing back at the Lupa-Sky. "This was our third time." Later, when Randall and Ellen had rejoined Ida and the twins, Ida said, "Now that our money's gone, we'll be able to enjoy things even more. We won't be hindered by having to decide how to spend anything." She led the way through the midway again, stopping whenever there was anything interesting to watch. At one of the side shows a barker was calling, "Get your tickets here. See the fattest woman in the world and the littlest man. Get your tickets here." At the next tent another barker called, "A free show every 15 minutes. Step right up. The next free show is about to begin." More than a dozen people had already stopped, and others drew near. "Step right up," called the barker. "See the freaks." Clay whispered, "What are freaks?" "Funny-looking things," answered Ellen. "Oh, they're not really funny," explained Ida. "They're mostly things nature's played mean tricks on." "Here comes one now," said Randall, and he lifted Dewey onto his shoulder so that he could see over the heads of the people in front. Ida lifted Clay. A thin young man with matted blond hair and a beard was led onto the platform. "A genuine wild man from the tribes of a far-off jungle," said the barker. Savage 100%. He eats frogs, lizards, and live birds. Don't stand too near him, folks. He could be dangerous. The wild man did not look dangerous. There was a vacant expression in his eyes as if he did not know what was going on around him, and he stood shivering in the warm sunshine as if he were freezing to death. We shouldn't gape at other people's misfortunes, said Ida. Let's go see something else. She led the way to the ball-throwing concession. There was a stand near the front of it, off to one side, filled with horse statues that were the prizes. They were all the same shape and size, but different colors. The mane of each one had been sprinkled with gold or silver glitter. Clay and Dewey stopped to admire the horses while everyone else watched three men who were throwing balls at stuffed dolls. The dolls were about the size of milk bottles and fit snugly into a wooden rack. There were 4 rows of them. Topple a doll! Topple a doll! Called the barker. The biggest of the 3 men, called Noon by his companions, knocked over one of the dolls, but on his next try he missed. That ball was off balance, he said, throwing another one. It hit a doll in the top row, but did not knock it over. Hey, he yelled, you got some of them nailed down. The barker walked over to the rack and lifted the doll out of it. He called to the crowd, hit 'em right and they'll fall every time. Step up, neighbors, and try your luck. The man, Noon, paid for 3 more baseballs. He knocked over a few of the dolls with them, but whenever he missed, he blamed the balls on or the targets. Ida opened the bib pocket of her overalls and began looking through it. Clay asked, did you lose your tobacco? No, said Ida, still searching. Ah, here it is. She held up a dime. I've been saving this for a special occasion. Maybe I'll throw baseballs with it. Will you win a prize? Asked Dewey, looking at the plaster of Paris horses. Maybe, said Ida, turning to the barker. What must I do to win a horse for my friends here? Throw 5 times, knock over 3 dolls, he said. There's nothing to it. Ida paid him, took the baseballs, and in rapid-fire order she knocked over a doll with each one. Nothing to it, she told the barker, who looked as if he couldn't believe what he'd seen. 2 young couples standing nearby cheered. Well, thank you, said Ida, bowing. She explained to them that it was all in the wrist movement, while Dewey and Clay tried to decide which horse they wanted. One of the men with Noon said, Hey, woman, Noon challenges you to a contest. Aw, no, I don't, said Noon. Thank you, said Ida, but I wasn't planning to do any more throwing. Come on, insisted the man, be a sport. Randall didn't know if he was saying it to Noon or Ida. A small crowd had gathered by then, and the barker told Ida, I'll stake you. What's the bet to be? We won't gamble on the outcome, she said, but if you'd like us to have a friendly contest, I'll be pleased to test my aim with, say, 10 throws. Noon did not look happy about it, but his friends were saying things like, Are you afraid a woman can beat you? And all you got to lose is your self-respect. They laughed as if they'd made the funniest jokes anybody had ever heard. Noon threw the first ball and knocked over a doll. Ida said, I can't beat that, and wound up for her first try. She threw the ball, and it barely missed a doll. Splinters flew from the edge of the rack. Noon threw again and knocked over another doll, and so did Ida. Their next 3 shots were hits also and toppled a doll each time. The contest continued. Noon missed his 6th shot, knocked over a doll in the 7th, and then missed 3 times in a row. Ida knocked over a doll with every throw except the first one. At the end, Noon turned to her and said, You ought to join up with the carnival. Everyone who had gathered around laughed. Why, thank you, said Ida, smiling at him. I'm glad you think I'm that good. I don't, said Noon. I think you belong in a freak show. He turned and started away, laughing loudly. Anybody as funny-looking as you are belongs in a freak show, he called back. His 2 pals followed him. The crowd seemed not to know what to do. Some of them snickered, and a few looked embarrassed. Ida's smile disappeared. Randall felt bad for her. He knew that being laughed at could be painful. He wished the crowd would break up instead of standing around as if there'd be another show. Ida looked at the barker. Thank you, she said, and he only nodded. We better go, said Randall. Yes, agreed Ida, and she led the children away. Dewey carried the blue horse with the silver mane that he and Clay had chosen. On the edge of the road heading home, Ida walked first, Dewey holding to one of her hands. Randall was next, then Ellen, and Clay was last. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Clay hurried to the front of the line. Taking Ida by her other hand, he said, I don't think you're funny looking. Don't you really? Asked Ida. Randall hoped that Clay would not suddenly change his mind. No, said Clay earnestly. I think you're prettier than anybody in the whole big world. Ida laughed. Well, thank you, she said. I think so, too. Then everyone laughed and walked along with a springier step. Sunday visitors. Aunt Myrtle, Uncle Ross, and Kathy Alice came to spend the first Sunday in September. Aunt Myrtle was feared by the children only slightly less than Aunt Ernestine. In Randall's opinion, Aunt Myrtle was more of a gunboat than a battleship. Her presence was not always overpowering, but it was usually best to get out of her way. She was a small woman, and Uncle Ross was a big hulk of a man. Their daughter, Kathy Alice, was average size for an 8-year-old. Mr. Sutton once described Kathy Alice as being loud for her age. When Aunt Myrtle's family arrived, the Suttons were in the yard. It was a warm day, and Mr. Sutton had taken off his coat and thrown it over one arm. He and his children had just arrived home from church. "My, it's good to see all of you," said Aunt Myrtle. "From Ernestine's report, I didn't know how I'd find you." Uncle Ross said, "I told you they'd be all right." "You look well," said Aunt Myrtle. "Of course we do," said Mr. Sutton. "We have on our Sunday finery." "I mean you look healthy," said Aunt Myrtle, glancing around at each one. "Some of your Sunday finery could do with pressing." Mr. Sutton pulled at his collar. "The shirt was a little fresher earlier this morning, but so was I." "Ellen, your dress looks nice," said Aunt Myrtle. "It's pressed," said Mr. Sutton, laughing as he patted Ellen on the back. "And she made it herself." "Did you really?" "Yes, ma'am, in home economics last spring." Aunt Myrtle looked at Randall and the twins. "What happened to their clothes?" "They didn't take home economics," said Mr. Sutton. Aunt Myrtle did not smile. "Their shirts don't look as if they've seen the flat side of an iron, ever." "Myrtle," said Randall's father, "can't you wait till we're sitting down to start pointing out our errors?" "But Ernestine and I have been so worried about all of you." "All of us are fine. Now come on to the porch where it's cooler, and let's not argue." He winked at Randall, who knew there'd be arguments all day. The twins took Kathy Alice to play in the backyard, and Ellen went inside to help Ida early with the cooking. Randall and his father sat with Aunt Myrtle and Uncle Ross on the porch till they were called to dinner. As they started inside, Aunt Myrtle said, "Now Kathy Alice and I could come and look after your family for a while. Ross has agreed that we can." "How often do I have to tell you that we're doing all right?" "But you desperately need someone to keep house for you, whether you realize it or not." "We have someone," said Mr. Sutton. "She may not do everything the way you or Ernestine would, but that's okay." He opened the door for them to go inside. "Come in and meet her." Ida wore overalls on Sundays, the same as any other day, but with two added touches. Clipped to the left strap just above the bib was an artificial flower. It was big enough to have been a sunflower, but it was shaped more like a rose, and its faded color was purple. Clay and Dewey had found it down by the road a month ago. Someone told them that it had once decorated the top of a very big box of candy. They had made a present of it to Ida, who insisted that it was too pretty to wear every day, but that she would certainly wear it on Sundays, if not all day, at Sunday dinner, in any event. So far she had kept her promise. The twins had been so pleased the first time she'd worn it that they looked all the following week for another flower. They wanted Ida to have one fastened to the right strap of her overalls. No more fake flowers appeared on the roadside, so they enlisted Ida's help in making one. The finished object looked more like a bedraggled feather duster than a flower, perhaps because it was made from chicken feathers they'd picked up in the yard. Mr. Sutton had called it a Rhode Island Red rose, because that was the name of the breed of chickens. There were a few white leghorns in the flock, and they were represented in Ida's second corsage, too. Mr. Sutton had teased the twins. "You'd better not let Ida wear it outside," he had said. "A rooster might chase her across the yard." Somehow the flowery and feathery touches made Sunday dinners, along with Ida's cooking, festive events. When Aunt Myrtle went into the room, Ida was turned to the stove, taking a sweet potato and raisin pie from the oven. When she turned around, Randall had to admit that she did look more like a feather-breasted giant than a person, and he believed for a moment that Aunt Myrtle was going to faint. She left off her conversation in mid-sentence, and when Mr. Sutton introduced her, saying, "This is Ida Early," all Aunt Myrtle said was, "Oh." Kathy Alice and the twins burst into the room at that moment, and there was confusion as everyone found a place at the table. During the meal, Uncle Ross, for a change, talked more than Aunt Myrtle. He kept saying how good the food was, and that if it wasn't so far from Knoxville, they'd come every Sunday for dinner. Even Aunt Myrtle could not find anything to criticize about the meal. Most of the conversation was about school, which was to start soon. The twins still insisted that they were not going. They would stay home with Ida Early. When dinner was over, Ellen excused herself to go back to church. Her Sunday school class was to practice a program for the night service. The rest of the family went out to sit on the front porch. Clay and Dewey played in the soft dirt at the edge of the steps where there had once been a sandbox. They tried to build castles with the soil, but it did not hold together well enough for anything grand. Their structures looked more like small igloos than anything else. Dewey molded an unusually big one over his foot. It did not cave in the way most of them did when he pulled his foot from it. Ida came out of the house and sat down on the top step. "That's a Jim Dandy frog house," she told Dewey. "Build another one." Aunt Myrtle asked, "Are the dishes washed already?" Of course they weren't. The meal was just over. Randall knew it was Aunt Myrtle's way of telling Ida what she should be doing. "Washed as they'll get for a while," said Ida, rolling a cigarette. "Care for a smoke?" She held out the bag of tobacco to Aunt Myrtle. "Certainly not," said Aunt Myrtle primly. There was a frosty silence. Ida lit the cigarette and said, "I think I'll take me a walk." "We want to go," said Clay and Dewey at the same time. They hopped up and started after her. "You'd better stay here with Kathy Alice," said Ida. "She's your company." "She can come with us," said Clay. "I don't want to," said Kathy Alice. Mr. Sutton called the twins back. "You can go to walking another time," he said firmly. "Let's visit with our kinfolks now, all right?" Clay and Dewey did not agree that it was all right, but they did return to their frog houses. Kathy Alice had stepped on the good one that Dewey had built. He began to rebuild it. Aunt Myrtle began to rail against Ida early. Randall had known it was coming. He suspected that Ida had known it too. Probably that was why she'd gone for a walk. "She's very strange," said Aunt Myrtle, "and you're crazy to put her in charge of your household." "The house is kept well enough to suit us," said Mr. Sutton, "and my family's well fed." "You can say that again," said Uncle Ross, patting his stomach. "If it wasn't so far from Knoxville, we'd come every Sunday." It was the third time he'd said it. "What's more," said Mr. Sutton, "the children are happy for the first time in months. So if you and Ernestine could just—" He was interrupted by Kathy Alice saying loudly, as if she hoped Ida might still be within earshot, "Ida Early's tacky looking." Dewey stood up. Glaring at Kathy Alice, he said, "She is not tacky looking." "She is so," said Kathy Alice, "and she acts goofy." Clay said, "She does not." Now," said Mr. Sutton, "let's calm down, and I think it might be a good idea, Clay, if you and Dewey showed Kathy Alice the new swing." "She's seen it," said Clay. Mr. Sutton laughed. "Well, how about playing somewhere else anyway?" "We'll go swing," said Clay, as if the idea were his. He led the way toward the backyard. "I don't want to swing," said Kathy Alice, but she trailed after the twins when she saw that they were going whether she did or not. Aunt Myrtle continued to point out the faults of Ida Early. Randall went inside and read for a while, and when he returned to the porch she was still insisting that Mr. Sutton find someone else. If not, she said, she would bring Kathy Alice and come for a while, welcome or not. "Ah, Myrtle," said Mr. Sutton, "you know you're welcome any time." Before he could say anything else, Kathy Alice ran onto the porch, stood between Aunt Myrtle and Mr. Sutton, and began counting loudly. Randall knew that if one of the twins had done such a thing, he'd have been given a swat in the seat and told to go somewhere else. But the grown-ups stopped talking till Kathy Alice had reached 100. Mr. Sutton said, "Clay and Dewey should have had plenty of time to hide by now." "We're not playing," said Kathy Alice. "We're playing country club, and I'm going to join." "I've heard about country clubs," said Mr. Sutton pleasantly. "What's the password?" "I'm not going to tell you." "Now, dear heart," said Aunt Myrtle, "you must talk sweeter than that." "I'm not going to tell you either," said Kathy Alice, starting away. A moment later she poked her head around the corner of the house and said in an even more smart-alecky tone than usual, "I'm going out to the barn to join the country club, and for the benefit of people who think they have to know everything, the password is a bucket of mud." She dashed away. "Oh, my goodness," said Randall, springing to his feet. "I'd better catch her." Aunt Myrtle grabbed him by the arm. Mr. Sutton said, "Myrtle, you'd better let the boy go." "I'll do nothing of the sort," she said. "If Kathy Alice is enjoying a game with Clay and Dewey, the older children should leave them alone." She always said older children as if Randall and Ellen were an evil force out to get Kathy Alice. "Have it your way," said Mr. Sutton. He pushed back in his chair and smiled at Randall. Randall smiled back.